I'm Heejin Chung from Korea, and myself and Laszlo, who is from Boston, will be talking about what's happening inside Samsung Internet developer team. So it's not really web developer oriented talk, but we just wanted to share what we did up till now and what we're doing. So Samsung is, well, known as a manufacturing company, making several kinds of consumer electronics, like air conditioners, smart televisions, mobile phones, and accessories like Gear VR. And we have smartwatches, vacuum cleaners, and kitchen appliances. And probably when you think about a web browser, you will think about browsers on desktops or your laptops or your mobile phones or tablets. But actually, Samsung has browsers on all these products. So we have Tizen browsers on smart TV, Tizen phones, and smartwatches, and even on refrigerators like Family Hub. And for our Android devices and Gear VR, we have Android browsers. Samsung actually has been making browsers for more than 10 years. Our first web browser was based on WebKit, and it was for feature phones. And when we started using Android as our platform for smartphones, we also deployed a web browser based on WebKit. So that browser was actually based on the Android stock browser that was included in Android. And when also for Tizen project started around 2011, so that back then we also were using WebKit for our Tizen browser. And you can see that early browsers are all based on WebKit, and we gradually moved to Chromium. What happened is that Chrome for Android was released, and in February, I think, 2012, and shortly after that, Google announced that they will no longer support Android stock browser. So with the web moving so fastly, it didn't make any sense that we stick to Android stock for our Galaxy browser. So we also moved to Chromium, built a new browser for our Galaxy devices. And in 2013, there was the Blink announcement. So Google forked WebCore from WebKit and started their own rendering engine. And with that Blink announcement, many browser vendors moved from WebKit to Chromium, and Tizen browser was also one of those browsers that moved to Chromium. So after Samsung Internet started to use Chromium, Tizen used Chromium. Our later browser, Samsung Internet Gear VR, also used Chromium. Now all our browsers in Samsung are aligned to use Chromium as their web browser engine. So you probably already know a lot about Chromium, but just to share some brief facts. Chromium is actually one of the largest open source projects in the world. So it's almost as active as Linux. And it consists of 18 million lines of code. They have a major release every 6 weeks, or around 6 weeks. And about 1,600 active contributors are making 1,000 to 2,000 patch commits every week. And it's not just Google, but very widespread contributors. So this is a really simplified structure of Chromium. The content part is where the web page content area, code for web page content rendering and interaction with the web page is mainly implemented. Chrome is for browser features like tabs, Omnibox, history, and bookmarks. And components, some features are componentized in components folder. When we first built our Samsung browser for Chromium, using Chromium, we tried to use as much as possible from open source. And it was based on Chromium M18. And you can see this blue part is supposed to be Samsung code. So it's not kind of blended in with open source code. So it was really all mixed up. We didn't consider that we would be doing engine upgrades in the future. So this was, I think, 2013, and it was released for Galaxy S4 and Note 3. And so when we were preparing for the next devices, our next flagship models, and we needed to update to the latest Chromium, it was like we need to start from the beginning and practically rewrite a new browser. So we did that once, and well, as you can imagine, it was so painful. So we tried setting up a dedicated team to work on engine upgrade only. That worked. It looked like it was going to work, but we figured out that it's with this structure. Using Chrome as much as possible isn't going to work for us. So we ended up doing several rounds of re-architecturing and finally ended up here. So we are no longer using the Chrome part anymore. We are built on top of content and reusing components. And these purple circles are actually our code in the lower area of Chromium. It's mainly for performance optimizations, features like web auto login and content blockers. So we made sure that these code changes were completely isolated from the browser app code. So whenever we do an engine upgrade right now, we don't need to change any part up there in the Samsung Internet part. So I think it actually is working out pretty well right now. We are doing regular engine rebases without much pain. We don't need a dedicated engine upgrade team anymore. It's like 1 or 2 people working constantly part-time on engine upgrade. So now we are using Chromium in a good way. It's working out for us. We're making a pretty good browser, I think. And it wasn't just code that we used from Chromium. Actually, when we were struggling for how to upgrade our engine more easily, we studied how Chromium open source is actually developing. And we benchmarked their development process so we could make a more sophisticated process for ourselves. So you can see that this is not actually the latest version, but our browser team is actually located all around the world. We have a team in Korea, India, US, UK, and China. And we need to collaborate tightly, actually. So in many cases, the HQ and other regional offices are kind of like, you do this, and they'll just do whatever the HQ tells you. But we wanted to work as one team, same level with each other. So we benchmark how Chromium works, really, and we set up tools for tight collaboration and communication. And Samsung was not originally a software development company, but so there was little, back then our software quality wasn't that good. So we wanted to change that. We benchmarked Chromium's review policy. We also have our own owner's policy, and we also started to do automated testing on actual devices. So whenever a patch is landing for Samsung Internet, it has to pass all the automated testing. Well, engine upgrade was one of the problems, and there was another one about of deployability. Back then, Samsung Internet was only deployed on new devices or maybe over-the-air upgrades. We didn't have any market upgrades available. And as you can see, this is also a little old, but if you just shift it up to Android O, it's probably the graph will probably look similar. As you all know, there's a fragmentation problem in Android. So there were already all these devices out there, but there was no way for us to test our browser on all of these devices. So we started small, started with just one model, Galaxy S6, in 2015. That seemed to go okay, since it's just one, and it wasn't that old, the device. And then the next time, we expanded to 191 types of Galaxy phones. And that time, it was, we didn't know, it was our first time many of the people were actually using Samsung Internet 2 point something, and it was suddenly upgraded to 4. So there were many feature changes in between, and I'm not sure if any of you like to use the text size changing feature, but actually that was deprecated in 3 point something, and many users actually left comments on Google Play saying, where did that feature go? I want it back. And well, that's when we realized that we have to listen to users' comments, and even if the percentage of some kind of some feature usage is really low, that percentage converted to actual people might be larger than we expect. So that's when we decided to set up a beta channel. And that actually helped because not only were we able to listen to user VOC, but we were even able to have our browser tested on more various devices. So now Samsung Internet, as we shared several times in our previous talks, is now regularly released in markets like Google Play and Galaxy apps. We have 2 full engine upgrades a year, and up till last year, we did 2 market releases aligned with the engine upgrades, but starting from this year, we are planning on 6 yearly releases. We are still maintaining our beta channel, and we are available on all Android phones and tablets. So even if you're not using a Samsung phone, you can check out our browser and test your web apps on Samsung Internet. And actually, we achieved a milestone last February, and for Samsung Internet Stable, we are on the 500 million and up downloaded apps list. We made it there. And our latest version, which is 7.2, is currently on beta, and soon will come to stable in the coming weeks. So I hope if you're not using Samsung Internet yet, you please try out and maybe rate us 5. So up till now, I just shared how we developed and how we are using Chromium in Samsung Internet. And from now, Laszlo will share what we're doing outside Samsung in the web community.
Thank you, Heejin. How's my voice? Good. I hope you appreciate the insight Heejin gave to our internal processes. This is somewhat unprecedented that I think a company, a top brand in a leadership position gives some of these good and bad background stories behind how we actually get to here. So it's quite exciting. So as Heejin mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the public-facing work that we've been involved with. So let me start asking, who here is involved with open source development? Okay, a few hands, 10 plus, great. So Samsung is one of the contributors to Chromium, and as was mentioned, it is one of the largest open source projects in the world. Google is the founding organization for Chromium, and just so that you understand the difference, Chrome is the browser product that is based on Chromium, and Chromium is the open source projects that you can look at if you go to chromium.org. So one of the ways to measure our contribution to Chromium is essentially our status or standing in the community. In Chromium, essentially, I think over 1,000 people working together on a daily basis. And that sort of organization requires a level of hierarchy. So the way that works is that first you show up and you want to contribute to the project. You propose a change, you propose a contribution, and if that gets accepted, then essentially you are a contributor. If you contribute enough, then you become a committer. And if you contribute a lot, then essentially you become a person who can decide what contribution gets accepted and what doesn't. So in Samsung case, we have almost 200 engineers who actually landed at least one patch to Chromium. Of that, about 10% reached to the point that is actually a committer. So I'm going to talk maybe a little bit more about what a committer means, because if you as a developer consider working with Chromium or contributing to Chromium, this is actually a level of status that's achievable with a little bit of commitment. So to become a committer, you would need to contribute about 20 non-trivial patches. So non-trivial meaning is changes the functionality. It's not some kind of white space or spelling error change. But you also have to demonstrate that you can work with the existing open source stream. You can at least interact with 3 different reviewers. You cannot just pick your friend and then land 20 patches and then call it a day. You also need to demonstrate that you understand all these tools and CI system that is set up for Chromium in this particular case. As you can imagine, there's a lot of automated QA that goes into Chromium. Chromium actually being built into over 50 targets. So there's the obvious ones that your code will be compiled on Android and Windows and Linux, but there's some less obvious build targets, for example, Chrome OS or headless Chrome. And when you contribute to the project, you actually have to understand that you cannot bake any of this. You can't just say, I tested it on Windows and I'm done. Any idea? These are some of the considerations, and I hope some of you get an appetite to look into this and consider this. But in Samsung case, we have 20 engineers who are committers currently. And as mentioned before, 3 of them are owners. They are essentially the maintainers or the final reviewers or code changes. That's, I think, also a great measure of the community, that you have external maintainers. So literally, this means that some of the Samsung employees are deciding what gets into Chromium. A little bit more about our contribution to Chromium in terms of numbers. So over the course of 5 years, we made close to 7,000 commits. So, and again, this is landed. This is in the code. So if you use Chrome on Windows, or if you're using Chrome right now, you are running that Samsung code because it's in there. So this rate is roughly about 500 commits a day. That's sort of our contribution chart or cumulative contribution. It's, at least personally for me, it's kind of interesting that it started up fairly sharp and then it sort of started to level off a little bit. I think initially a lot of our contribution went into the Android port and making sure that Chromium runs well on Android. This is obviously Samsung interest. And then right around end of 2015, I think it gets to the point where our level of contributions sort of slowed down a little bit. It's also interesting where we contribute. Most of our contributions, about 2/3 is in the rendering engine side. And then 1/3 is sort of other functional areas like autofill or some of the components. We obviously contribute a little less to the actual UI layer because that is different for Samsung. But contribution doesn't just mean code. It means, for example, filing bugs. So we filed close to 2,000 bugs. These are not necessarily fixed by Samsung, but they filed by Samsung. And it's a community. So some bugs are filed by us and fixed by Google or others. Or some bugs are filed by, let's say, Intel and fixed by Samsung. So we work together on this. If you're interested and if you're into that, you can go to that link in the bottom and you can look at every single Samsung contribution one by one. So this is great. It's a great trend. But why Samsung doing this? So I mean, there is obviously the sort of somewhat moral interest that we don't want to just take it and use it and then take advantage of it. We want to sort of contribute back and be a healthy part of the open source ecosystem. But the other very tangible benefits of contributing to open source. One of them is that Heejin mentioned that we actually internalize some of these processes that we learned in open source. Like, for example, how to communicate within Samsung or how to review each other's code within Samsung. But to be able to do that, first we had to learn ourselves how to do it so that we can internalize it within Samsung. And the way to learn it is in open source. So essentially, we're doing open source to learn. And as engineers, we always have to learn. Another one that's also directly measurable is essentially our rate of rebasing from open source. So the more we learn to upstream more changes, the easier it became to take our latest update from open source. And this resulted in less bugs and moving faster, and also more security for our end users, because we were able to fix our security issues faster. So this slide talks a little bit more about our current focus or our very recent focus. Web payment, PWA and service workers, WebVR and WebXR. These are our areas that we mentioned many times today. We obviously contribute to this in open source. This is our interest, this is our core focus. But the other areas that's sort of less known and perhaps a little bit less interesting, but it worth mentioning that, for example, we're driving the geometry interface implementation. We were involved with Canvas 2D and SVG compatibility. SmartGo is an ability to navigate between forms using virtual keyboard. This is an area that we introduced in Samsung Internet first and then upstream it to open source. There's a blog post about that if you want to look it up. Predictability means essentially standard compliancy. This is a very complex area where we have to balance not just following the standard word by word, but also making sure that we're compatible with other browser vendors. And sometimes we find that the spec is wrong and browsers are correct, and then we go and fix the spec. That's why it's not just spec compliance, it's actually predictability, that your code runs predictably well across all browsers. We're quite passionate about this part as well. So, and then in terms of contributing to the ecosystem, beyond just the code, it always works in combination with standards. So, I mean, a lot of the bugs are pointing to actual W3C issues. It always works together. So it's kind of natural that we involve with standardization as well in sort of in a very in-depth manner. And then developer advocacy, including events like this and blogging and educating the community. So I wanted to finish up on a note that's perhaps a little bit actionable. If you want to get involved with all this, you can, even if you perhaps not a C++ developer. So if you're a web developer and you're testing your code on Samsung Internet, which is something that you should really do, and you find something, just file a bug. That's where you can. We have a GitHub entry for that. For Chromium, Chromium itself is C++. But actually, there's a lot of ways you can contribute if you're not a C++ developer. You can file a bug, or you can triage existing bugs. So if memory serves me well, I think the number of open bugs currently in Chromium is about 20,000. So just imagine that we come in every day, and it's not obvious which bug to fix. So if you start a bug or you prioritize a bug, that's actually, or you just comment on a bug, that is contribution. Or you can contribute to tests. So our test is, of course, web code. That's how we test the browser. The web code itself is part of the Chromium project. So if you improve the test, which is just a piece of HTML and JavaScript, CSS, then you're contributing to Chromium. This is very exciting. Part of the tests are also shared between browsers. This is so-called web platform test. So you can literally create a patch to Chromium that fixes some of these web platform tests, and then that gets propagated to other browser testing as well. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. I think currently Chromium only passes about 50% of these web platform tests. And someone needs to go through them and figure out why is that. Another less known area that people don't know is that the developer tool itself is essentially a web interface in Chromium. So if you're a web developer, you can literally improve the look and feel of the dev tools, for example. So I hope that's actionable. I hope some of you get an appetite to get into this. And if you want to chat more about these opportunities, just talk to me afterwards.